Vulnerability is not winning or losing. It's having the courage to show up and be seen when we have no control of the outcome. Vulnerability is not weakness. It's our greatest measure of courage. Of course, no other than Brené Brown. Being vulnerable is something we come into this world as. We are vulnerable to our surroundings and rely on others. We rely on others to provide us with food, shelter, and clothing, but most importantly, love. Vulnerability for me was a weakness because as a child, I was abused by both my parents and nothing was ever done about it. For me, I thought strength came from holding on to every trauma I ever went through and keeping all the family secrets to myself. I relied on my family to provide me with the essentials, and they did. I was fed and I was clothed. Therefore, I felt I owed them. For many years, I kept all these secrets that eventually turned into deep shame, and I carried that shame around for 30 years. Vulnerability today means so much more than when I was a child. To me today, it means strength and courage. Being vulnerable is not just about being open about our emotions, but it's standing up for yourself and for others. It's doing the right thing. It's owning your mistakes. And it's telling the truth. And so tonight, I give you me in my most vulnerable state. Looking into my life growing up, people thought I had it so good. Well-known family name, I lived in a big mansion on 50 acres, and money seemed endless. But I've learned to never judge a book by its cover because you never know where someone's been if you haven't walked a mile in their shoes. I was molested by my stepfather from an age I cannot recall because I was so young, and this continued until I was 10. But life goes on. Nothing was done. Our family dynamic changed in that my parents did not live together anymore, but we still did family functions. It was as if everything was just swept under the rug. My mother never won the greatest mother award either. She taught me from an early age how to hide bruises that she left on my body, which was very beneficial as I got older and entered abusive relationships. Secrecy breeds shame, and shame keeps you sick. I started stockpiling all this shame at a young age, and keeping everything in made me really sick. All this shame made me, I made really bad decisions growing up. I figured that I had such a crappy life that I would be such a crappy person. When I was 14, I chose to live with my stepfather over my mother. I could manipulate him and not my mom. And so living with him meant that I had endless amounts of money, I had name brand clothes. By 14, I was allowed to take the car. I used what he did to me to get what I wanted. I was a high school dropout, and I did a whole lot of partying. By not healing my trauma, I gave myself more trauma from all the bad decisions I made. So when I became a mother, I started to really realize the family cycle was continuing. I was partying the same way my mom partied when I was a kid. Eventually, I lost custody of my children and ended up in a very violent relationship. When we enter relationships, we should be vulnerable. We should discuss our fears, our dreams, our past, our traumas, and let them know who we really are. I refused to be vulnerable for so many years, and for good reason. I don't think anybody knew who I was. Honestly, I don't think I knew who I was. People saw me as rough around the edges and tough. Those 8 years I spent in an abusive relationship taught me that vulnerability would get me killed. Eventually, I got my kids back. Eventually, I left the abusive relationship. But being vulnerable still was a weakness to me. Strength to me was being strong. It was keeping the shame in. It was that I went through so much that I must be such a strong person. But it really came down to other people's opinions of me, which really aren't my business. But I was such a people pleaser, I cared about what other people thought about me. If everyone knew I was a drug addict, that I lost my kids, that I allowed a man to control my life, that I still talked to my abuser, that I sold drugs to make ends meet, I would be looked at as a monster. But I'm not a monster. So how did I come to share my story and be vulnerable? First, it started when I was at my lowest point, also known as rock bottom. There's one place to go when you're that low, and it's up. I was coming off of drugs. I was fighting with my ex-husband's brother. and he refused to leave my house. We were fighting so bad, we were throwing glasses at each other, there was tables being flipped, and he wouldn't leave unless I gave him his rent money back. So I threw a $100 bill at his face and I said, why don't you go overdose? 6 days later, he did, and he died. That was a beginning for me. I didn't want to be that person anymore. I didn't want to be that person that told someone to go die, and I didn't want to be that person that was being told to go die. So I had to change. So I quit partying. I then attended my first event, surrounded by strong and vulnerable women. They shared their story of not only trauma, but how they got over it. So they shared their triumphs. And literally this light bulb went on in my head that I should share my story. So I did. I shared it with the lady sitting at my table. And about 30 minutes later, I was pushed onto a stage to share my story with the whole audience. I learned then to stand on my story and not in it. And at that moment, I was 100% authentic and vulnerable. Vulnerability means being authentic. Instead of being laughed at, booed off stage, or being looked at as a monster, I stood to a standing ovation, tears, and understanding. At that moment, I knew I was meant for greatness, and that my mission was to help other people be vulnerable, to help other people get past the trauma, that we're not bad people because of the bad things that happened to us. Since that day, I've embraced vulnerability in my everyday life. For me to move forward, I needed to forgive myself for all my past mistakes. I came to realize that my brother's overdose was not my fault. I came and asked my children for forgiveness. I also told my parents that I needed to live my life without them in it. The biggest part that took me a bit was being open about my stepdad molesting me. At first, I would say I'm a survivor of childhood sexual abuse, but I would never give up who the abuser was. I always feared that I would ruin my grandmother's name. And even though she's been dead since 2004, she was well known in the business world. And I felt that it was my duty to keep the family name and to keep the secrets under the rug. But when I went public and people started to realize who abused me, I found out that other children were also molested by the same man. And not just any children, but the children that I babysat as a teenager. How could I have thought that I was the only one that he would hurt? I wanted to run back into my hole in that moment and be strong and continue to keep the secret. But here's the thing. Once you get used to being vulnerable, it's really hard to go back. The night I found out about the other person was the night that I took myself to the RCMP and I pressed charges. And in that moment, I took my power back. I no longer worried about anybody but myself, my well-being, and doing the right thing. And that was telling the truth. So today I'm a great mom. I no longer feel the need to numb my life with drugs. I wake up every day, and I mean every day, grateful that I woke up because the alternative sucks. I admit my weaknesses, but in admitting my weaknesses, I show how courageous I am. I'm afraid to be alone. I'm afraid I'll never find true love. I'm afraid my children will repeat the same cycles that I repeated, that my mom repeated, that her mother repeated. But I'm not gonna let my fears dictate my life anymore. Bob Marley once said, being vulnerable is the only way to allow your heart to feel true pleasure. And because of my vulnerability, I not only feel pain, but I've learned to feel extreme joy. Thank you.